Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randall Baier. We'll be taking a look at some of the books that Rip Rap has received recently. The topics include the notion of a deep economy, Iraqi occupation, plantation life, and estrogen replacement therapy. Welcome to Rip Rap, Randy.
Thank you. Esoteric as always.
Yes, that's right. A walk on the wild side. This book by A Deep Economy, The Wealth of Communities, and the Durable Future by Bill McKibben is this discussion again on how can we run things, our economy and our communities in ways that don't just consume. And so I was, again, fascinated with this. We've had other discussions along this line. But he's talking about moving beyond growth is the paramount economic ideal and pursue prosperity in a more local direction, with cities, suburbs, and regions producing more of their own food, generating more of their own energy, and even creating more of their own culture and entertainment. And I found that just fascinating. He's the author of 10 books, and he's currently a scholar in residence at Middlebury College. But it's that same shift toward rethinking how we're living.
Well, certainly in the arts, it's working. I think his model might be actually being successful in terms of local development of arts and cultural activities. And there certainly now is a move towards really seriously thinking about energy development, energy acquisition, I guess you'd say creation, I guess is what I should say, energy creation.
Well, the immediate thing in terms of the news reports are how the farmers are going to planting the biggest corn crop in years since the 1950s.
Because of the fuel economy.
Because of producing ethanol. So to offset the oil from the Middle East, and that's just wonderful. It's a huge economic impact. But I think this is one of these things that they're showing that actually, if you're doing things locally, you don't have all those transportation costs. It strengthens the local economy, and it has, like you said, a deep impact. And of course, that nicely leads us into another book, The Occupation of Iraq, Winning the War, Losing the Peace, by Ali Alawi, who is the senior advisor to the Prime Minister of Iraq. Who's been traveling around. Is one of these truly international guys that he goes between London and Baghdad. What I found fascinating in this book is that he is talking about how what may have happened is that we may be looking at a time when he says time's running out. The monumental patience of the Iraqi people has nearly ended. They've endured so many hardships and broken promises, but they still have kept the light of hope flickering. They're very near a terminal breaking point. And so it's kind of a warning that even for people in Iraq, that this is something that's quite ominous, really. And he says, the situation there is not hopeless right now. An informed public should not tolerate the half-truths, platitudes, and outright deceptions that have characterized the official line on the country. He hopes this book will set the stage for an informed public. Now, this is just as we're sitting here where Congress, both sides, Senate and House, have passed resolutions saying that we've got to get out of Iraq and let it, work its own way. And I find this is kind of an interesting thing to start thinking about. That someone who is from Iraq is saying, well, wait a minute, we need something else than what's going on.
He's so close to the Iraqi administration, and yet it seems like he's I wouldn't say committing hubris, but he's being so realistic in this sort of review. I mean, I think he's actually escaped several bombings himself. His name is in the news a lot. Yeah. So the message being that even those in the higher ups of the Iraqi administration are saying,
well, there's this real sense the whole fabric is coming apart now, and you hear about these awful things that are going on there. I mean, there's now the latest thing is insurgents are using chlorine, and so they'll do a suicide bombing, but it involves chlorine, so it's gassing people by the hundreds, and again, my deepest concern is that once we decide to get out of it, and I think it's inevitable that we will have to, because we're in the middle of a civil war. We're not in the middle of some simple insurgency. That it'll be very difficult to get the troops out. I mean, we're so embedded in so many people and so much equipment. It just staggers, But this guy's saying, well, there's some real problems with Iraqi people. And I think what's happening is the leaders are starting to feel that they can't control it themselves. And this was the hope that, that we would go in there, we put in some people in office or encourage the leaders to come in. But the complexities of ethnic conflict, between the three groups, the Shiite, Sunni, and Kurds, is so profound. And then there's all this other dynamics of oil politics and Iran.
And the geopolitical situation, exactly, Syria and Iran.
Iran has gotten into this thing where they're holding hostages.
Yeah.
And
in the middle of this week, I saw this PBS video about pilgrims from Iran going to Karbala, Shia site in Iraq, by busloads, sort of arranged pilgrimages, and it was quite remarkable. I mean, I'm sure there is violence at this. There has been violence at these occasions, but thousands and thousands of people go to this shrine on a yearly pilgrimage. And millions, actually, you're right. I mean, it was just an enormous crowd, massive, and it's a across the border type of thing. I mean, this has been going on for years and years, and it was just kind of remarkable. Out of the you just don't have a sense from the news that we get that this kind of thing is continuing. I mean, we'll hear 2 or 3 times a year. We'll see a reporter at some large event like that, a pilgrimage site at the various shrines around Iraq. But we don't have a full picture of how those activities sort of evolve through this crisis.
Packed. This is the obligatory pilgrimage or Hajj that the Quran requires, if people can possibly do it, and to make at least once during their lifetime. It's just millions of people, and it's so packed, and they often have trouble with that because, I mean, there's so many people, and they're all making this swirling around this huge stone monument to Karbala.
Yeah, the one to Mecca. This was Karbala, for an imam, the historical imam who had died. So there's so many different sites. Of course, Mecca being the
but all these different, I mean, it's just.
But the pilgrimage is a remarkable thing.
It's also fascinating.
Well,
like the point you're making, it's fascinating. The media cannot accurately encapsulate because they're looking at snapshots.
Yeah.
But you can't get something that's massive and a process, or a huge transformation or a huge event like that with just snapshots. It'd be like.
It was really interesting. I mean, it followed 3 people. A professor, a carpenter, and a teacher. So, kind of a professional, a working man, a woman, a group of women, and one woman in particular. I think maybe she was the teacher. And the impact on their families, and several of them supplicated themselves. I mean, one in particular made a crawl, an honoring crawl through the town to the shrine, and that was his life's promise. He had promised to do this in his religious practice, and I mean, it was just interesting because there was no event of sort of the scale that we're just used to seeing on TV every night, and yet we know that it just filled things out for me to see that this was going on.
Well, the next book that I've got is by Erskine Clark, and it's won the Bancroft Prize, called A Dwelling Place, A Plantation Epic. And it's fascinating because just like we can't understand slavery, I mean, it's hard to understand this abstract thing. This is more of a snapshot of the plantations, or a series of them, during this time, the early 1800s on through. At least for this is a historian who's talking about this, and I just found this fascinating. he talks about it being a history of two peoples living together in the Georgia coast in 1805 to 1869. One's white, one's black,
Right,
and what they go through. And to a certain extent, it's kind of like the upstairs, downstairs version.
Yes, right.
And when you talk to people about slavery, there were the field slaves and the house slaves. So there's all of that kind of upstairs, downstairs kind of thing. But I also thought this book is fascinating because he talks about Rai Zizek in his book, Transformation Virginia, that the final presentation of one's research should not be primarily a record of the researcher's labor, but a persuasive reconstruction of the experiences of past actors. And so in that sense, this book functions as kind of a novel,
Interesting.
almost, that you take in inside what it felt like and what it was like to be there.
How did he get this data? Apart, not that I want to focus on the researcher's labor,
no,
but
it's
such an enormous book, an undertaking. I mean, to document this.
It's very laborious.
Bring out the
like
stories.
I said, he was trying to reconstruct it from documents
Right.
and all the standard historical research.
A lot of letters, diaries, and that kind of primary
research,
material. Yeah,
interviews with people.
fabulous.
But
So,
what's nice is that now you get these secondary and tertiary accounts, which then allows you to put it more into context. We had interviewed Rafia Zafar on her book, We Wear the Mask, which was about African Americans, women, who had been writing before the American Revolutionary War, which seems a very radical insight, but it's true. And in doing the research for her book, she ran across an unpublished autobiography and realized that it was her great-grandfather.
Wow.
And the name of it was God Made Man, Man Made the Slave, and that was based on a poem that he had written. But the context was it was illegal for slaves to be able to read and write. And the way that he learned how to read and write was he was a guitar player, so he made a musical scale, and then he would show the letters as notes.
Yes.
But these little insights, and you run across these now as people are realizing how important pictures are, and like the one of the lynchings. Someone's reconstructed that, and now that's going around as a exhibit, and documents like that. And then you can get the wonderful books like this where you really took the time to slow it down and take a look at it. So that's a wonderful.
Glad you brought that out.
Then we go from that to Elizabeth Siegel Watkins and the Estrogen Elixir, the history of hormone replacement therapy in America.
My gosh.
We think of this now pretty much as, trying to manage menopause, but it's also an anti-aging thing from early on, and it's a very seductive thing. That's a terrible pun to do, but it was a very attractive option because people wanted to appear to still be young. They didn't want to have to go through the menopausal transition. And she just points out about it was a horrible thing because now they're finding out that the risk of doing that far greater,
is much higher,
than what they thought. And so subsequent research has shown that women paid a terrible price for this anti-aging thing. I think that was more attractive than anything else.
And I imagine because of the cultural overlay of American culture and sort of the culture of youth, etc., be young, it sort of became almost a sort of added technology of cosmetics in a way. I noticed that you've got another book coming up that we're going to look at on developments of medical technology.
Right.
So this
but this
slightly
was,
from the different point of view.
And she said there is no elixir. I mean, using estrogen is a completely, a bad idea, I guess is the easiest way to say it. That this was the hope of the fountain of youth kind of psychology, and it wasn't there. It did have some value for certain specific purposes, but as they started doing more and more testing and taking a long-term view of it, it turned out to be really an illusion.
And one needed to have, I imagine, like with any kind of drug therapy, hormone therapy, a very small number of women in this case would benefit from the actual treatment, where in fact it might have been beneficial, but in general it became caught up into this.
Let's start getting into the whole mega marketing thing. Now everyone's got to have
the
it.
Fad, the craze,
and it's still hard to let up.
Exactly.
The next one is I'm personally fascinated with this woman because she was a photographer who, Lee Miller, it's The Art of Lee Miller, by Mark Hayworth Booth, but she was one of the most original, ambitious photographic artists of the 20th century. I mean, she got linked up with Man Ray and Steichen and Stieglitz. Arnold Gethne was in Paris. That's in 1928 when she linked up with Man Ray.
Mm-hmm.
But this book really brings all of her life together, and it's very unusual because she was a film actress, she was a photographer, had a real thing as you know, kind of she had photojournalism and some really startling images of the Dachau concentration camp. I mean, she really did some outstanding stuff. And this is the first book that kind of brings it all together.
Put a comprehensive look at her, her works. Is this a self-portrait or a portrait of her?
That's a portrait of her,
mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a portrait by Pablo Picasso.
Yeah, Picasso and Anthony Penrose.
Yeah, but the one that she did of her, I think, is right here. We'll show that.
Oh, okay. Okay, this is Miller. Arlesienne.
Yeah, but it's a surrealistic thing.
Yeah.
And she was very much into surrealism, and I think you can argue that the role of women with much of this avant-garde art has been vastly underappreciated, and we've talked about that in the past.
Yeah.
That
well, there were several books that we've reviewed in the past about the models and the inspiration.
There's Dora Maar, there's Frido Galler, you know, Tina Modotti.
Yeah.
They all contributed some really profound
artists
ways.
in their own right, and also it's not exactly behind the scenes. They're actually creative forces.
Well, and Lee Miller moved rather well between journalism and art and photography and, you know, the film, all these different aspects, and did quite an interesting job with it. And there's a picture of her actually in Adolf Hitler's bathtub. I mean, you know, this.
How bizarre.
Because she was right as they were taking over.
Yeah, she was there.
She was right there.
Right there with the troops coming in 45.
Yeah.
Into Europe.
But it's also kind of a fascinating thing of the image, the visual image in the 20th century, and how profoundly that affected our notions of what was going on, and how conscious she was aware of that. That's what I found fascinating.
Right. Well, I can see the influence, either the influence of Man Ray on her or the influence of her on Man Ray.
Right.
With all this solarized imagery that she's perfecting and portraying. And that's one of Man Ray's, of course, marked, noticeable techniques that he uses. Nice. Well, good. Anyway, moving on to my pile here. I see you've put a book entitled Presidential Secrecy and the Law. This is a new volume by Robert Palito and William Weaver concerning what is now, I guess we could call, our current crisis with the executive branch, and certainly the legal status not only of the executive branch, but the limits that the executive can take legally with their responsibilities and what actions they can actually do. I think one of the biggest out is this controversy about the presidential letters that they essentially, President Bush and his group have been sort of bypassing legislation with these letters, enacting all kinds of
well, there's a number of
things.
measures. There's the warrants for, you know, telephone tapping. There's the secrecy about where they're putting prisoners. You know, at one point the CIA had prisoners parked in Europe. There's secrecy as far as the conduct of the war.
Yeah.
Even to the extent, as we've talked about before, that the administration will allow pictures to be taken of bodies coming home from Iraq.
Yeah. Right.
But
the caskets,
these two authors are raising an interesting issue. They do think that it's very important to have this balance of powers, and that secrecy raises a very troubling consequence. If it's secret, then it's hard to put these balance of powers into play.
Yeah, exactly.
And that destabilizes the government. Their solution is that all ought to happen in terms of the courts is also equally troubling because, as we've talked about before, the Supreme Court is unbalanced. I mean, it's heavily influenced by people who have vested interests of their own, particularly with the Bush administrations. But I thought it was a very interesting and reflective study of well, what are we doing now, and what are the implications of that? What's absolutely fascinating in that book is they give this scenario about these different people, and you recognize names like Donald Rumsfeld sitting around the table talking about how dangerous it was to release certain kinds of information, and then the authors revealed that it was 1971, not 2000.
Interesting. Yes. Yeah.
You know, and it really puts the handle on there that when presidents want to remain secret, there's also other motives involved. And the administrators and people in the administration will always be claiming special privilege, executive privilege. I mean, we currently have a crisis in terms of why so many U.S. attorneys general were fired by the Bush administration for apparently political reasons.
Yeah.
And it's kind of evolving into discussion, not even about that, but the fact that the incumbent attorney general was not being forthright when he spoke to Congress about what was going on and how much he knew of what was going on, which is all part of the secrecy kind of thing.
Yes, yeah.
It also underscores just how difficult it is to evaluate the balance of powers if information is being withheld from you.
There is a chapter on accountability, section of one chapter in here. The titles of the chapters are kind of revealing. One is an overview, a historical, theoretical perspective of what's called the secret presidency, which, as you pointed out in the 1971 example, it sort of shows a bit. But the classified president, state secrets and executive power, the shadow president, the attorney general, and new anti-terror laws, you know, bringing it up to today, and the president and national security surveillance. And where does this go in the new millennium? What kind of technologies and capabilities does this, you know, the secret presidency have now?
Well, particularly with the new technologies, don't necessarily leave a footprint or a fingerprint. I mean,
or they leave so many that you can't possibly track.
But all across the world.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
It's really troubling. You know, it's apparently invisible, and yet it isn't. It really does raise all these issues that are very troubling. And so this is yet another book where they're trying to evaluate, and I find it fascinating. We've talked about this a number of times, about how scholars are trying to understand this and put it into context and explain the significance of it. And it, you know, in legal context, it really, there isn't a simple solution. I just have not agree that the only branch, I think the Congress ought to get involved as it is.
They seem to have abdicated certain rights and responsibilities that they're actually that are written into the Constitution.
And Secretary of the House, or Speaker of the House, Pelosi, had a fascinating. She said, "Well, a new sheriff is in town," kind of a mentality. In other words, President Bush is getting have to get used to this.
A bit of accountability.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Well, now speaking of the phrase "the same time," same station. This is an interesting history called Creating American Television, 1948 to 1961, the real genitive period of American television, where so much really was done live, swing over from radio into TV, and then it found its own kind of own voice. Great picture of Phil Silvers and Ed Sullivan conferring with one of the old TV sets in the background. This book by James Bauman, who is the chair of the communications department at Mass Media Communications at the University of Wisconsin. And it's a long, involved history with a lot of documentation discussing the, I don't know, the sort of the difference, the political point of view or the cultural point of view between the major networks, but also the influence of the way that success in media had sort of transfers over from radio. So they're trying to take a radio model of the serial idea of things coming at a regular time during the week that the family will actually plan around, and how the medium itself sort of changed that because of the immediacy of television, specials, live entertainment, and the capability of delivering actual pictures.
Well, I've taught a media literacy class, and what you need to realize, well, what they're talking about is that there was a major shift. In the 50s was a major, like you were talking about, formation period for television as an industry. But there was debate going on. Should it be more culturally based or should it be commercially based? Well, by the early 60s, this issue had been resolved in favor of the commercial.
Yeah, yeah.
So extensively now that people are under the illusion that the viewer matters except as a cipher to figure out, you know, for the networks to justify the cost of certain programming. So one media literacy person that I read called it to renting an audience. I mean, the audience is only there as justification for the advertising dollars spent.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where it gets really pretty wild, and why we can have 500 channels and now most of it spent on paid programming to advertise everything from vacuum sweepers to knives to can openers and exercise machines. It's more about filling the void with, you know, for profit.
Constant.
But it is, the 50s and 60s were, as you're saying, a wonderful time. I mean, that's the Ed Sullivan Show. There's a lot of wonderful bonanza, a lot of wonderful programming.
It's amazing how much was done live too, and the creative juices. The early shows that came out were involving major writers. They were live. It was live television. In fact, if you look at some of these old black and white shows, there's a kind of shimmer, a kind of halo around all the performers. The quality of the video is different because it's actually being broadcast live. There's no pre-taping.
Oh yeah, they had that. Sometimes at the early phase, they had broadcast it live a couple times. You know, one for East Coast, one for West Coast.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's right.
But
that's
also, that was one of the issues resolved during this thing. They found out that they didn't have to broadcast live. That people were perfectly content and didn't see the difference between taped
and live action.
And so now everything else is taped.
Right. It's all done.
That you're seeing. The
seasons are in the can, you know, and everybody's on vacation.
Some news shows like on
movies.
CNN, you're seeing the same tape
absolutely.
loop over and over while they're talking. This one little 10-second loop of an accident or a fire or an explosion is playing over and over again. So I mean, it's interesting what the audiences will tolerate in order to get what they want.
It's a very good point. It's amazing that we tolerate the film loop in our visual consciousness, because it's like having a still picture. It's, you know, just equating. You'll have one still picture. I remember, or not remember, frequently we see there'll be a correspondent on some radio link up or telephone link up, and you'll have a picture of the map, say the map of Baghdad, and maybe an inset of the reporter's picture. Well, it might as well be that with these film loop, these moving film loops in the background. Because
turns into an endless B-roll.
Exactly.
Just B-roll.
Just roll it. Yeah. Good. This was quite a review. Thanks so much.
Thank you for being a Rip Rap again.
Well, it's always my pleasure, and always an eclectic treat.